Greetings! I'm Greg Hill, and I would like to share with you a practical summary about the life of Kit Carson, specifically as it relates to American expansionism, also known as Manifest Destiny. Soon after Europeans began migrating to this land and claiming it as their own, the progression could not be stopped until we would become a nation from sea to shining sea. The United States of America extends from the Atlantic Ocean to the Pacific, bordering Canada to the north and Mexico to the south. Acknowledgements. I dedicate this work to my grandmother, Dolly Skinner Hill, and my father, Kenneth Hill. My grandmother initially instilled an interest in Kit Carson as she proudly proclaimed her mother was Kit's niece. And to my father, who dedicated much of his later life to our family's ancestral heritage. My research leads me to understand that I am Kit's second cousin, 7 times removed, with common ancestor Alexander Harvey Carson, who lived in Scotland from 1652 to 1718. I also want to thank John M. Carson, Kit's great-grandson, who I met in 2001, graciously providing me a tour of his office and access to many of Kit's material possessions, as well as his own reenactment items. Introduction. Kit Carson played an integral yet unintended role in American expansionism. Indeed, it is described he led the way. Had anyone asked him early in his adult life about the term manifest destiny, he likely would have been completely dumbfounded. Not because he was illiterate, which he was, nor because he was ignorant, he was not. Rather because he had no interest in or knowledge of the subject. He was a simple man, interested only in an adventurous life in wild places. Traveling with trade caravans over the Santa Fe Trail, along with many years of trapping, hunting, and trading, he came to know the West and its native inhabitants as well or better than any other man. Throngs of migrants and gold diggers would follow the routes established by John C. Fremont, known as the Pathfinder, who was guided by Carson on his first 3 expeditions to places like Oregon and California for a better life and opportunities unavailable in the East. Other men like Carson were in attendance during Kit's tenure as well as the remaining expeditions. Military and political leaders would take advantage of Kit's intimate knowledge of Indian cultures and his devotion to duty, even at times to the expense of his own conscience. Kit is credited with saying, "I do not know whether I done right or done wrong, but I done what I thought was best." Migration to and within America. When pilgrims from Europe first arrived on the shores of the New World, westward expansion was destined to follow. As early as 1618, land west of the colonies was being offered to citizens for the planting of tobacco and other marketable crops. Along with these anticipated opportunities came controls by an elite class of aristocrats. To escape their entrapments, the hardiest of these migrants began moving further west to gain independence. Despite the constant threat of conflict with indigenous peoples, Native American Indians, who had populated, albeit sparsely, this land for generations. By the mid-1700s, Ulster Scots, Scottish people who had previously settled in Ulster, Ireland, began migrating to America. They became known as Scots-Irish soon after arrival. Because of their hardy disposition and angst against anything British, they were such fierce combatants in the American Revolutionary War that George Washington is said to have stated, if the cause was lost everywhere else, he would take a last stand among the Scots-Irish of his native Virginia. Indeed, they were said to have been born fighting. Upon migrating west of the Appalachian Mountains from North Carolina, led by Daniel Boone, a description of these Scots-Irish reads, swarthy as an Indian, and almost as sinewy, with hair falling to his shoulders from beneath a coonskin cap, a buckskin hunting shirt tied to his waist. His netherman was encased in an Indian breechcloth, and his feet clad in deerskin and moccasins. When Thomas Jefferson became president, our nation consisted of 13 colonies east of the Appalachian Mountains. He negotiated the Louisiana Purchase from France in 1803. To discover the purchased land, he sent out 3 essentially successive discovery expeditions, the Meriwether Lewis and William Clark, also known as the Corps of Discovery, Zebulon Pike, and the Thomas Freeman and Peter Custis. Land mostly beyond the Rocky Mountains was still controlled by other countries. With the exception of Texas, this contested land is in the purview of our main character, with the United States gaining interest in what is known as the Lower 48 States. Madison County, Kentucky is where the story of Christopher Houston Kit Carson begins. Pre-adulthood. On Christmas Eve, 1809, a boy child was born to Lindsay and Rebecca Carson. Other than the arrival of a new child into this world, he was just one of many born into humble beginnings on the frontier. He was 11th of 14 children born to Lindsay, which included older half-brothers Andrew and Moses, frontiersmen in their own right and significant inspiration for Kit's eventual future. After heading further west to Boone's Lick, Missouri, Lindsay was killed instantly in September 1818 by a fallen tree branch while clearing his new land. Now fatherless, Kit's attention was focused on survival skills as a hunter and frontiersman. He later recalled, "I was a young boy in the schoolhouse when the cry came, 'Injuns!' I jumped to my rifle, threw down my spelling book, and there it lies." Though illiterate with no ability to read or write, he was not ignorant, which would be proven the remainder of his life. Becoming obstinate and rebellious after his mother remarried, he was contracted as an apprentice to David Workman in Franklin, Missouri, at the tender age of 15. Franklin was the eastern terminus of the Santa Fe Trail. Kit detested the captivity of working as a saddle maker and repairing leather, stating, "The business did not suit me and I concluded to leave." While engaged in this work, he overheard the conversations of men fresh from the frontier and Santa Fe Trail, telling their tall tales about encountering grizzlies, Indians, mountains, and rivers. As most young boys his age, he dreamed of an exciting life, and being anxious to travel for the purpose of seeing different countries, I concluded to join the first party for the Rocky Mountains. After borrowing a mule from a neighbor in 1826, he found a caravan headed for the Santa Fe and was hired on as a cabby boy or wrangler. Moving to Taos, Kit lived with Matthew Kincaid, a trapper and explorer who had served with Carson's older brothers during the War of 1812. Carson was mentored by Kincaid in learning the skills of a trapper, while also learning the necessary languages for the trade. Eventually, he became fluent in Spanish and several Indian languages, including sign, also possessing a working knowledge of French. By applying these skills, his fate was sealed, becoming perhaps the most celebrated frontiersman since Daniel Boone. While excelling in every aspect of wilderness skills, including bravery, strength, courage, endurance, fortitude, the dexterity of mind and body, the temperament to live a wild and dangerous life, beaver trapping, game hunting, horsemanship, bodily combat, reading sign and instincts, celebrity status would come to haunt him later in life. Mountain Man. From 1829 to 1841, he lived the life of a typical mountain man, living off the land, trapping beaver, hunting buffalo and other game, and trading with Indians, most of whom were friendly. In fact, except for mountain men encountering hostility with Blackfeet while trapping beaver in their waters, Kit lived rather peacefully among the Indians and married an Arapaho woman named Wa'anibe, or Singing Grass, in 1835. He famously won her affection in a duel with a bully Frenchman named Chouinard at the 1835 rendezvous. A rendezvous was an annual event where mountain men, trappers, traders, and Indians all gathered and bartered, traded, sold, and swapped various items such as skins, pelts, guns, jewelry, and whatever else they needed for the trade. It lasted anywhere from a few days to several months, and was a time for getting new supplies, renewing acquaintances with old friends, story swapping, drinking, and general rowdiness. Though Carson was a habitual smoker, he avoided alcohol and other nefarious activities that would jeopardize his livelihood. His wife, Wa'anibe, or Singing Grass, was a great companion to Kit in every aspect of life. Some of her activities included soothing Kit's aching body from ice-cold streams, having warm water waiting at the end of each day, making and mending clothing, and bearing 2 children. Unfortunately, she died from complications with the birth of their second child. Carson later recalled, "She was a good wife to me." In 1841, Kit was hired on as a hunter for Bent's Fort, established by William Bent and Saron St. Vrain as a primary trading post for the buffalo robes provided by Cheyenne and Arapaho Plains Indians, as well as being a supply depot for the U.S. Army, including John C. Fremont and Colonel Stephen Watts Kearny, for explorers and other travelers. Wild game was necessary for feeding the throngs of people at the fort, and Kit's unmatched marksmanship never failed to grace the dining tables with fresh meat. Kit's reputation will forever be part and parcel to the fort's heritage. His friends of the era included Lucien Fontenelle, Jim Bridger, William Bent, Charles Bent, Saron St. Vrain, Lucien Maxwell, Creole, French, Canadian, African, Shawnee, Scots-Irish, English, Prussian, and Irish trappers and traders, among others. He possessed a truly remarkable characteristic for making lasting friendships with people of extraordinary ability and influence. Kit's unique characteristics of rapid decisiveness, quick action, leadership skills, never leaving a comrade behind, and understanding the Indian lessons of retribution, often treble-fold after their first strike, caused him to be held in high regard, sometimes out of respect, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of appreciation. Kit was known for having strong medicine among all those who knew him and lived on the frontier. A story that fellow trapper and trader Joe Meek told, which reveals Kit's characteristics, reads, "We went on a hunt across the east of Grand River when about 5 miles off they described a large band of Indians mounted and galloping towards them. As they were in Comanche country, they knew what to expect if they allowed themselves to be taken prisoners. They gave but a moment to the observation of their foes, but that one moment revealed a spirited scene. Fully 200 Comanches, the warriors in front, large and well-formed men, mounted on fleet and powerful horses, armed with spears and battle axes, racing like the wind over the prairie, their feather headdresses bending to the breeze that swept past them in double force. All distinctly seen in the clear air of the prairie and giving the beholder a thrill of fear mingled with admiration. The first moment given to the spectacle, the second one was employed to devise some means of escape. To run was useless. The swift Comanche steeds would soon overtake them, and their horrible doom was fixed. No covert was at hand, neither thicket nor ravine, as in the mountains there might have been. Carson and Meek exchanged 2 or 3 sentences. At last, "We must kill our mules," said Carson. In this plight, a dead mule was far more useful than a live one. To the ground sprang every man, and placing their mules, 7 in number, in a ring, they in an instant cut their throats with their hunting knives and held on to the bridles until each animal fell dead in its appointed place. Then, hastily scooping up what earth they could with knives, they made themselves a fort, a hole to stand in for each man, and a dead mule for a breastwork. In less than half an hour, the Comanches charged on them, the medicine man in advance shouting, gesticulating, and making a desperate clatter with his rattle, which he carried and shook violently. The yelling, the whooping, the rattling, the force of the charge was appalling. But the little garrison in the fort did not waver. The Comanche horses did. They could not be made to charge upon the bloody carcasses of the mule, nor near enough for the riders to throw a spear into the fort. This was what the trappers had relied upon. They were cool and determined, while terribly excited and wrought up by their situation. It was agreed that no more than 3 should fire at a time, the other 3 reserving their fire while the empty guns could be reloaded. They were to pick their men and kill one at every shot. At the charge, the Comanche horses recoiled and could not be urged upon the fort of slaughtered mules. Again and again, the Comanches made a fruitless charge, losing as often as they repeated it. Thus the battle continued through the entire day. They were fighting for their lives, and they meant to win. At length the sun set on the bloody and wearisome day. 42 Comanches were killed, and several more wounded. They had lost faith in their medicines, or believe that the trappers possessed one far greater than any of theirs. Under the friendly cover of the night, the 6 heroes who had fought successfully more than 100 Comanches took each his blanket and his gun, and bidding a brief adieu to the dead mules and beaver packs, set out to return to camp. Life as a mountain man, though foremost among Kit's fondest memories, was not suited for children without a mother. Kit took a second Indian wife to care for his children. But when the youngest died from a tragic accident and his wife left him, he took his oldest child, Adeline, to St. Louis to be raised by family members in a cultured environment. John C. Fremont Expeditions. Had it not been for a chance meeting with John C. Fremont, Army officer with the Corps of Topographical Engineers, on a steamboat leaving St. Louis, Kit's name likely would have been lost to history like many other frontiersmen. Fremont, the son-in-law of Senator Thomas Hart Benton of Missouri, was commissioned by President James K. Polk to provide national surveys of the Oregon Trail, Oregon Country, the Great Basin, and the Sierra Nevada mountains to California. In Carson, Fremont found the guide he was looking for, as well as a lifelong friend. Accordingly, he wrote, "I was pleased with him and his manner of address at this first meeting. He was a man of medium height, broad shoulders, and deep-chested, with a clear, steady blue eye and frank speech and address, quiet and unassuming." Kit told him that I had been some time in the mountains and I thought I could guide him to any point he wished to go. Carson guided Fremont's first 3 expeditions. Although Fremont was accomplished in wilderness skills, his ambitions were greater than his abilities. Mortal peril would have doomed the party had it not been for Kit's singular steadiness. Fremont's reports were widely read back east, and with frequent high praise of his guide, Kit became an instant hero in his own lifetime. Numerous skirmishes occurred with Native Americans during these expeditions. Most Indian tribes were very possessive of the territories they claimed, usually after battle with other tribes, and did not take well to anyone passing through. With Carson's lead atop his favorite horse Apache, Fremont's band were accomplished adversaries and could not be deterred from their mission. Despite today's popular revisionist historical culture, Kit did not hate Indians, nor did he attack them without first being provoked. Quite to the contrary, living more like an Indian than an Anglo, adopting their way of life became inseparable with his personality and decisions. Dime store novelists, picking up Kit's name from Fremont's reports, created wildly imaginary tales. Though popular reading books, they were pure fiction, depicting a larger-than-life Indian killer with no basis in reality. The fictional Kit Carson bore almost no resemblance to the real one. As a stranger once put it after being told the small man before him was the legendary Kit Carson, "You ain't the kind of Kit Carson I'm looking for." After Colonel John Chevyton's Sand Creek Massacre against Black Kettle's band of friendly Cheyenne Indians, Kit referred to him as a dog and a savage for killing squaws and papooses along with many of Carson's friends. Carson stated they once owned all this country, yes, plains and mountains, buffalo and everything, but now they own next door to nothing and will soon be gone. Taos and life with Josefa. In Taos, New Mexico, Carson met a beautiful young woman named Josefa Jaramillo, the daughter of a prominent local family. Their love for each other became a remarkable pattern for a successful marriage. Kit had been drawn to Taos when first arriving in the territory, working at odd jobs when not traveling to places, among which was Chihuahua, Mexico, with Colonel Trammell as an interpreter. He subsequently went to California, joining Ewing Young, an accomplished trapper and trader, becoming perhaps Kit's greatest mentor. Life in Taos was rather quaint and quiet, suiting Kit's personality. He fully adopted their culture and finally found a place he could call home. It was close enough to Santa Fe to meet up with caravans, yet a world away from the bustling, noisy conditions. To win Josefa's parents' approval, he was required to convert to Catholicism. Though raised as a Protestant, he did not hesitate. He was baptized on January 28, 1842, in order to prepare for marriage. Louis Girard may have perfectly captured Kit's thoughts when he wrote, "Her style of beauty was of the haunting, heartbreaking kind, such as would lead a man with a glance in his eye to risk his life for one smile." Together, Kit and Josefa had 8 children. Despite his fierce reputation, Carson adored his children, including numerous orphans he and Josefa had adopted. Playing games and laughing like a child, he would roll around on the ground as they jumped on top. His pockets were often filled with lumps of sugar and candy that they would wrestle away from him. Unfortunately, duty called him away so often that he spent more time away from them than with. Yet absolute love was never questioned. Since it was necessary to earn a living for his family and his skills were needed on the frontier, off he would go. Soon after Carson left on one of these occasions, the life of Josefa and her older sister Maria Ignacio Jaramillo, wife of Charles Bent and brother to William Bent of Bent's Fort, were saved in the Taos Revolt of 1847 by Charles heroically giving up his life to save the women and children in his household. Greater love has no one than this, to lay down one's life for one's friends. St. John 15:13. Gold! During Fremont's third expedition, Kit became embroiled in the Bear Flag Revolt in California. The Bear Flag Revolt was essentially the acquisition by military force of California for United States possession from the Mexican government. Much of his time, though, was spent as a courier, riding horses, or preferably mules, back and forth between California and Washington, D.C., often with his dog and a small contingent of hand-picked compatriots. Fremont wrote, "It was a service of great trust and honor, of great danger also. Going off at the head of his own party with carte blanche for expenses, and the prospect of novel pleasure and honor at the end was a culminating point in Carson's life. In 1848, one of his reports took news of gold found in the stream at Sutter Sawmill near the present town of Sacramento, California. With that one report, America was changed forever. The California Gold Rush of 1849 brought people in mass from all around the world. Some 80,000 people arrived that year alone, and ultimately some 300,000. About half of those arrived by ocean, docking in San Francisco Bay, leaving abandoned ships behind. The town's population rapidly grew from a scant 200 people to over 30,000. Kit never engaged in or seemed to have the slightest interest in gold fever. California statehood was inevitable. The landscape in California, as well as the route in between, was transformed forever. The impact on indigenous peoples was catastrophic, leading further to often deadly confrontations. Military career. Carson's military career essentially began when being appointed as Indian agent in 1853 over the northern New Mexico tribes of the Utes, Hickory Apache, and the Taos Puebloans. Headquartered in Taos, he was able to spend significant time with his family. By all accounts, Kit was successful in keeping the peace while meeting the needs of those entrusted to him. He became particularly close to the Utes, making friends for life. Many referred to him as Father Kit and would hold their hands out to him when he entered their camps, shouting "Como le va," or the Indian "How." His integrity was so great, they trusted Kit before any other white man. He was a fair and honest agent, frequently at odds with the government officials over the treatment of the Indians. Often he and his wife would feed several from their own rations to stave off starvation. Kit came to the realization that settlers in traditional Indian lands were the greatest source of conflict, taking away traditional hunting grounds and driving off game, leaving many sick and dying. In 1861, the American Civil War broke out, and Carson was commissioned as a lieutenant of the 1st New Mexico Volunteers to keep Texas Confederates at bay. For his exceptional service, President Lincoln brevetted him as Brigadier General, though the rank never was actually bestowed on him. Famous Civil War soldier William Tecumseh Sherman recalled, "And I was very anxious to see a man who had achieved such feats of daring among the wild animals of the Rocky Mountains and still wilder Indians of the plains. I cannot express my surprise at beholding a small, stoop-shouldered man with reddish hair, freckled face, soft blue eyes, and nothing to indicate courage or daring." During his involvement in the Civil War, Indian raids on the settlements increased. Once the war was over, General James Henry Carleton's attention was turned to Native Americans. He knew that Carson had the knowledge, work ethic, reputation, and devotion to duty to tame and control their depredations. Kit was exhausted, suffering from injury, and was reluctant. He had misgivings of changing forever the native way of life which he so comfortably had adopted. Though Carson submitted his resignation numerous times, Carleton refused to accept them. Kit had become extremely conflicted between his conscience and duty. Rather than face a certain court-martial and disgrace, he agreed. It was his job. As a result, his reputation among indigenous persons suffered greatly. In his campaign against the Apaches had become weary of fighting. They voluntarily placed themselves under Carson's control to be moved to a reservation. Carson was not particularly fond of the Apaches and assessed that they were truly the most degraded and troublesome Indians we have in our department. We daily witness them in a state of intoxication in our plaza. In the campaign against the Navajos, while Kit had some prior goodwill among them, they had become perhaps the most menacing and had become bitter enemies with most other tribes. Members of other nations were happy to join forces with the U.S. Army to help bring them under control. Carson and his integrated companions employed a scorched earth policy common among warring tribes and ultimately a devastating but effective strategy used by the Union Army during the Civil War. Starvation brought many of the Navajo in, and they were forced into the reservation at Bosque Redondo. At Canyon de Chelly, a Navajo stronghold where most of the remaining tribe was holed up, was nearly impregnable. Carson's actions were decisive and successful. As greater starvation set in, the Navajos finally surrendered and then were led to Bosque Redondo. Many died en route. Navajo history refers to this trek as the Long Walk of the Navajos, and Kit has been reviled ever since, though he was not actually present during the walk and was only following the orders of his commanding officer. Interestingly, the Navajo were in awe of him by having thrown a magical lasso around them. Out of fear and respect, they gave Carson the name Rope Thrower. At the reservation, government rations and blankets were insufficient, causing more illness and death. Kit complained bitterly on their behalf, but to no avail. Due to his failed experiment, General Carleton was subsequently transferred back east, and the Navajos were allowed back to their homeland. At the First Battle of Adobe Walls, taking place in the Texas Panhandle, Carson was successful, and the battle was considered by some to be Kit's finest moment. Factors that made the Kiowas and Comanches sue for peace in 1865. From early encounters of European immigrants with indigenous peoples through the age of expansionism, Indians were often considered as wild and uncivilized, perhaps less than human. While their manner of living and culture was starkly different from European inhabitants, they were a proud people with generally noble characteristics. While Kit's career, particularly in his military campaigns, brought disaster to the nations, the unintended consequences impacted him and his kind as well, since he identified more with them than his Anglo-Saxon brethren. In his later life, Kit became quite philosophical, particularly as it relates to Native Americans, literally working on their behalf to improve their conditions until his death. Perhaps with a greater understanding of the real Kit Carson, his spirit through us can foster the changes necessary for greater equality in living standards and opportunities for all. By doing so, indigenous peoples may fully reclaim their high levels of pride and nobility as American citizens collectively. Final days. Kit retired from the military, moving his family to Boggsville, Colorado, with the intentions of ranching. He was again asked to serve his country by accompanying the Utes back to Washington, D.C., due to friendly relations he had developed, especially with Ouray at Fort Garland. The purpose was to offer a treaty for peace, though they did enjoy sightseeing and meeting dignitaries. Kit had been suffering from failing health for many years and used the opportunity to consult with top medical specialists. He was diagnosed with an aortic aneurysm, having no medical opportunity for survival. Upon his return to Boggsville with his friend Major D.C. Oakes, although quite ill, tradition holds that he insisted on building his last campfire at the present site of Daniels Park, Douglas County, Colorado. A monument has been erected at the site in commemoration. Further en route to Pueblo, Colorado, Kit sent a note to Josefa that he was on his way home. Though very nearing the birth of their 8th child, Josefa met him for the remainder of the trip. Soon after arriving in Boggsville, Josefa gave birth, but died 2 weeks later following complications. Grief-stricken with Josefa's passing, Kit's condition became even worse. He was transported to Fort Lyon, Colorado, to be attended to by Dr. H.R. Tilton, Assistant Surgeon, U.S. Army. Most comfortably resting on the floor with buffalo robe and blanket, Dr. Tilton read to Kit. Though illiterate, he loved to have others read to him for pleasure, to gain insight, and to obtain knowledge. The doctor wrote, "It was wonderful to read of the stirring scenes, thrilling deeds, and narrow escapes, and then look at a quiet, modest, retiring but dignified little man who had done so much, a true man in all that constitutes manhood, pure, honorable, trustful, sincere, of noble impulses, a true knight-errant, ever ready to defend the weak, without reward other than his own conscience." On May 23, 1868, Kit sprang up from his bed, and with blood gushing from his mouth after his aorta ruptured, he spoke his last words, Doctor, compadre, adios. Immediately following Kit's death, flags at the fort were lowered to half-mast. The following day, guns were fired each minute. Fifers and drummers performed their traditional march. The cavalry fired 3 volleys. Taps was played, and then repeated cannon fire filled the air with thick smoke and the smell of gunpowder. Kit's body was buried beside Josefa's in Boggsville. At their request, the following year, their bodies were moved to Taos, their home, and reinterred in what is now known as Kit Carson Cemetery inside Kit Carson Memorial State Park. In summation, Kit's life would tell the true story of how the West was won: American expansionism. The words, "He led the way," is engraved on the obelisk on the Santa Fe Plaza. He represented his country, and he represented what America was becoming. And so if we look at Kit Carson and we get uncomfortable, well, that's because we're looking in the mirror at ourselves. For most persons, since the culmination of manifest destiny, whoever lives in or has benefited from the pleasure of visiting lands west of the Appalachian Mountains, we are arguably giving our stamp of approval, even if unintendedly, to the concept of American expansionism and manifest destiny. Also to whom Kit Carson really was. We have the opportunity to positively shape America's future by how we engage with each other as fellow human beings. As an ancestral family member, I, along with my grandmother and father, am honored to be related to Kit Carson and extend my greeting to his memory. Hola, fellow brother, compadre, adios, and ole. After learning about the life of Kit Carson, I now encourage you to sit back and enjoy my song entitled Our Beloved Kit Carson, an American Frontier Ballad.
Hola, fellow brother of the border trail, protector and defender, could be counted on as well. Oh, Carson was the bravest of the American West, bound to duty and country, and ready for each test. Oh,
hailed as the Nestor of the Rocky Mountains and an American border man, dear old Kit, another proclaimed of this hero of the great American West, pitting man against elements, savage beasts, and against other men, Carson's marksmanship and horsemanship equipped him fully for success. Born in Kentucky of Scots-Irish ancestry with the Daniel Boones and others, sharing their customs, beliefs, and practices of life on American borders, though fortified and always on watch for hostile Native Party raids, The first note of a fiddle signaled the dance that climaxed their long day. Of shorter height, with ruddy red freckled face and quiet disposition, his soft blue eyes, frankness of speech, and flowing flaxen hair belied the fierce, determined countenance and tenacity of a bulldog in position, springing into action like a rattlesnake after sounding of alarm in the air. As a youth, Kit Carson escaped work that to him was distasteful, but anxious to see different countries, longed for the adventureful. He lit out one day with a borrowed mule for the Spanish Santa Fe, hired by a caravan as a caballado and cook to earn his pay. Catch up! Catch up! Whoa back! All set! Stretch out! Hep! Yelled the captain of the trader caravan at early dawn's light. Then down the trail they lumbered with goods and livestock in tow, for to trade with and make money from the Mexicans, don't you know?
Hola, fellow brother of the border trail, protector and defender, could be counted on as well. Oh, Carson was the bravest of the American West, bound to duty and country, and ready for each test. Oh.
With Ewing young, Kit earned his apprenticeship as a trapper. Learning quickly and more dependable than most, became quite adaptable. Masterful with rifle, horsemanship, and skilled interpreter, he could talk with native tongue or sign with any other speaker. Independent trapping brought Kit his greatest lifetime pleasure, though fraught with more danger, brought benefits beyond all measure. Singing Grass, his Arapaho darling, had warm water waiting at the end of each day. She was a good wife to me, Kit later recalled, employing her own loving way. Pictured riding a dependable horse with pistols and rifle at the ready. For to capture the plunder of the day, he was always steady. With powder and lead, blanket and moccasins, he was a hawk. Carrying tobacco and pipe, all needles, medicine, knife, and tomahawk. Possessing strength, courage, endurance, fortitude, and dexterity of mind and body, with temperament to live a wild and dangerous life in the West as anybody, his wilderness skills of reading sign and instincts matched that of any other man. Brave with nerves of steel and indomitable will, his foes he could all fan. Living more like an Indian and possessing great medicine, the native way became inseparable with his personality and decisions. Bluffing, retaking stolen horses, and fighting with rifles and knives, the more danger faced, the more courage shown, gained status and prize. As Fremont's guide, he did become a most famous and true companion by keeping up hope, strength, and a remarkable sense of direction. Their westward expeditions became a living map to overland routes as scouts. Whether to the Pacific Ocean or a manifest destiny, Anglos would strike out.
Hola, fellow brother of the border trail, protector and defender, could be counted on as well. Oh, Carson was the bravest of the American West, bound to duty and country, and ready for each test. Oh,
drawn to Taos since first arriving in New Spain, yet with frequent adios, he married his loving wife Josefa, whom he called Chapita or Little Joe. His desire throughout was a quiet life in Taos with family and other intentions. Speaking Spanish as his first language, along with other locals, including Indians. Kit's commitment to earning a living and sense of duty kept him wayward akin, carrying transcontinental dispatches west to east, then back again, bringing news of the successful U.S. expansion into California and New Mexico, becoming the very symbol of the American frontier and always on the go. Though extremely complex tribal rivalries and politics existed, successes he achieved as Indian agent to New Mexico persisted, enjoying a lifelong friendship with the chief and people of the Utes, who referred to him with brightened faces as Kitty. How cute! Holding hands and shouting, "Como le va?" or the Indian, "How?" His integrity so great, they trusted Kit before any other white, and how? Representing them well before local authorities and Washington itself, paying for many of their necessities out of his own pocket himself. Commander of the New Mexico Civil War Volunteers, turning back Texas Confederates, President Lincoln brevetted him as Brigadier General for exceptional service. Always faithful to responsibility and the practical value of duty, Carson was loved by most and respected by all, which he applied so aptly.
Hola, fellow brother of the border trail, protector and defender, could be counted on as well. Carson was the bravest of the American West, bound to duty and country, and ready for each test. Wola, fellow brother of the border trail, protector and defender, could be counted on as well. Oh, Carson was the bravest of the American West, bound to duty and country, and ready for each test. Oh,
enjoying children jumping on top of him and lying on the ground with pockets full of candy and lumps of sugar all around, or laughing, swapping yarns and playing games with friends with gesticulation of hands and shoulders till almost unhinged. One could hardly recognize this great hero of history and legend as William Tecumseh Sherman once inked, or brilliant victor in service to country, with James Henry Carleton adding to his laurel wreath. One final trip back east with a delegation of Ute chiefs to sightsee, meet dignitaries, and offer a treaty for peace. Returning home, Kit fell gravely ill, and Josefa was summoned to his side. But alas, 2 weeks later, following childbirth, she had died. Most comfortably resting on the floor with blanket and buffalo robe, his doctor would read to him of his thrilling deeds and adventures around his globe. Grief-stricken by Josefa's passing and catatonic with no chance of survival, Kit arouses to speak his final words. "Doctor, compadre, adios," with death's arrival. For family and friends who live on inspired by his humble greatness, the wonderment of nature that filled his soul with thoughtful stillness, believing that God's providence guided his every step of the way, we utter the same sweet words to Kit, compadre, adios, and ole!